Now it goes without saying that Niki Lauda was one badass dude. He wasn't afraid to speak his mind, he had the respect of people inside and outside of motorsport, and he wasn't going to take any guff from anybody. This is also a man who suffered life-threatening injuries during the 1976 German Grand Prix when a crash at the notorious 14-mile Nürburgring left him with burns all over his body and lung damage, to the point where he was given the last rites on his hospital bed. Then within 6 weeks, he was back in the car and racing again, determined to beat James Hunt for that year's title. He was also the same man who had bollocks the size of space hoppers to tell Enzo Ferrari to his face without batting an eyelid that the car was shit, and then had the balls to then say, okay, if you fix it and I'm not 0.3 of a second faster than I was before, you can sack me. And there was also a story in there about how he was negotiating his wages with Enzo Ferrari, and he basically told Enzo, I want what Andretti's having. So Lauda had taken on some of the biggest egos in motorsport and beaten the lot of them, but none of these wars of words were as draining as the time he took on one of the biggest corporations in the world, Boeing. Now, over the years it became the largest aircraft manufacturer in the world, watching its other competitors in the commercial aircraft sector drop one by one as they were absorbed or just outright going bankrupt. And at the time the main part of this story starts, Boeing was 5 or 6 years away from acquiring McDonnell Douglas, who produced the F-15 Eagle, amongst others. So where does Lauda come into all of this? Well, Lauda was not just a Formula 1 driver, but he was also a pilot and a businessman. And in 1979 he set up Lauda Air, which started up its flight operations in 1985. But it wasn't until 1987 that the licence for carrying passengers was issued. It was a typical small charter airline at first, leasing aircraft such as the BAC-111, and then in 1985 acquired several models of the Boeing 737 family, from the 200 model all the way up to the 800 model, and basically what that means is each of them's got various passenger carrying capacities. By 1990 though, they were operating full-on international flights, from Vienna in Austria to places like Kuala Lumpur, Sydney, Melbourne and Bangkok. Also in 1990, the airline acquired a couple or some of Boeing's 767-300ER model jets. Now these jets were twin-engine aircraft with the ER tag basically meaning it had a longer range than the standard 767, and were kind of the precursor to the 777 which would enter service later on in the 90s. And these planes would form the long-haul part of the company, and the jet itself would easily run from Munich to Los Angeles without having to stop. So Lauda Air would use them to run between Bangkok and Hong Kong and Vienna and all the way out to Australia, which at that time would have required at least one layover. But then on the 26th of May 1991, Lauda was informed by somebody at the company that one of these 767s had gone down in Thailand, taking 223 souls with it. Lauda Air Flight 004 took off from Bangkok International Airport at around 11 PM local time, having stopped at Bangkok on its way back from Hong Kong's Kai Tak Airport. As it flew along its route, it climbed up to its cruise altitude, and approximately 6 minutes into the flight, the captain and first officer noticed a warning on the engine displays, saying that a possible system failure could cause the thrust reversers to deploy while in flight. Since there was nothing in the manual that said such a thing, they cleared the warning and continued, assuming that some moisture had got into the computer. It wasn't until 9 minutes later that the first officer on board the plane said, "Shit, reversers deployed," after which the CVR, the cockpit voice recorder, recorded a shuddering sound followed by a loud snap. Because one reverser was out and the other engine was running as it should have been, the left-hand side of the plane took a dive, after which the two pilots figured out what was going wrong, but were too late to get out of that dive. So what is a thrust reverser? Now, I'm not a pilot, I've just played flight sims for about 25 years, so like most people who play them, I like to pretend I'm a fully qualified Boeing test pilot. The thrust reversers work by directing the jet thrust in the opposite direction to how it would go normally. They don't actually slam the turbines into reverse, they just direct it out the other way to slow the plane down on landing, beyond just using the onboard brakes. These reversers are deployed upon touching down on the runway, but this Lauda Air 767 had managed to do it mid-flight. As a result, the plane broke up as it nosedived towards the mountains at close to the speed of sound, disintegrating as it did so, and the fireball rained down on the mountains about 3 or 4 miles from the nearest town. As you can imagine, everybody on board was killed, and dental records had to be used to identify most of the victims. The captain, however, was found strapped in his seat, and the plane's impact point was around here, somewhere near the border with Laos. At first it was thought that a bomb had destroyed this plane in a similar manner to the Lockerbie bombing 3 years previous, but since Austria had been staying out of international affairs such as the recent war in the Persian Gulf, investigators struggled to find a motive. Even though the investigation hadn't even started yet, Lauda had travelled out to Bangkok with a Boeing executive to see this wreckage for himself, and he'd noticed that the thrust reversers on the left-hand engine were out, but the thrust reversers on the right-hand engine were still in. And even then, he determined that it was that had caused this crash. Remember, nobody had even found this out yet because the CVR hadn't been analysed yet because, like I said, they were still tidying up the wreckage. So now begins the waiting game. Meanwhile, Boeing was staying very, very quiet on matters, with what little they did say on it trying to deflect the crash to be on pilot error. Now, Lauda wasn't convinced, so he headed to London Gatwick Airport to run some simulator tests. Lauda said in an interview with Graham Bensinger that he owed it to the victims' families to get answers as to what caused this crash, and if Boeing wasn't going to be proactive in finding out what caused it, he would. And he also made a promise. If it did turn out that it was indeed pilot error or something that had gone wrong with the maintenance of this plane, he would resign immediately as the head of Lauda Air, because the safety of those passengers rests with him. In the Gatwick Airport test, Lauda found that deploying the thrust reverser in flight was survivable. Pop it back in and away you go. But like in the movie Sully, the results were thrown out because Lauda was deliberately and expecting these reversers to come out so he could react and fix it accordingly. Similarly, Sullenberger had around 90 seconds to process what was going on before he finally decided, I'm landing on the Hudson. So the investigation continued and allegations came out to say that it was indeed Lauda Air's fault that the plane had crashed, but Lauda instead went direct to Boeing in Seattle and asked to try the simulation on Boeing's own 767 simulators, which were a little bit different to the ones at Gatwick. He tried the simulation 15 times and crashed 15 times. Boeing then admitted that it was actually the thrust reversers that caused the crash, but they wouldn't actually make a statement on it because they claimed it would take too long for them to word it properly to avoid getting sued and things like that. So Lauda asked to borrow a 767 and deployed the thrusters in the air if Boeing was so certain it was so safe, basically adding, look, if it crashes and I die, it crashes and I die. Boeing said that it wasn't safe to do that, so Lauda had the answers he needed. It was a design flaw on the 767 and not the fault of Lauda Air. It had taken 8 months for Boeing to admit that it wasn't safe. What Boeing had determined is that this little O-ring that was in the thrust reverser system had fallen out, so that when the air rushed over the engine, the reversers just popped out and the thrust went back in the opposite direction to what it should have been doing. So basically, you couldn't put it back in once it was out because of the speed of the air rushing over it. This is on top of Boeing telling the Federal Aviation Administration that there was absolutely no way that the reversers could be deployed in flight. But in 1982, at the insistence of the FAA, they managed to devise a test where this was possible. And the plane didn't crash. When Boeing ran this test, the plane was travelling at about 250 knots or so. Lauda Air 004 was travelling at about 400, and unlike the Boeing test pilots, the crew of the Lauda Air flight didn't know this was going to happen and weren't able to react accordingly. But in the book Inviting Disaster, author James R. Charles wrote, the point here is not that a thorough test would have told the pilots Thomas J. Welch and Joseph Toomer what to do. A thrust reverser deploying in flight might not have been survivable anyway, but a thorough test would have informed the FAA and Boeing that thrust reversers deploying in mid-air was such a dangerous occurrence that Boeing needed to install a positive lock that would have prevented such an event. To make matters worse, this thrust reverser system was present in most models of the 737, 757, 767 and even 747 of Boeing aircraft, meaning that Boeing had to analyse and fix about 1,600 aeroplanes. In these cases, Boeing made the thrust reversal systems work in such a way that the reversers would only deploy once the aircraft was on the ground. Lauda said that the stress of finding out what happened to Lauda Air Flight 004 was actually worse than the stress of his recovery of that 1976 Nürburgring crash, as well as working towards those 3 world titles. Reason being, it was 223 lives that were resting on his shoulders, and he was determined to find out what happened to this plane and getting the answers that the victims' families so desperately wanted. Lauda Air was merged into Austrian Airlines in 2012, with the company being rebranded Austrian My Holiday in 2013. He also had another airline simply called Niki, which was merged into Air Berlin in 2011. So then a look at the time Niki Lauda stood up to 223 victims of a plane crash and took the whole thing to the top of one of the most powerful corporations in the world. If you've learned something new here today, then be sure to like the video, and if you're not subscribed, do get subscribed and also get that bell on so you never miss out on a future video. Massive thanks as ever to the good folk of Patreon, and if you want to support me at a more personal level, you can do so by following the link in the description, which will also have a link to Discord and also to my socials. So until next time, I've been Millward. Have a great day wherever you live in the world, and I'll see you all again soon for another video. Goodbye.